Jessica Bayley holds a BS in biology from the Simon Fraser University, and she joined the Coastal Invasive Species Committee as executive director in December of 2022. She previously worked as part of the South Coast Conservation Land Management Program, where she implemented an invasive plant management program for conservation lands throughout the South Coast. She also has held various roles with the Invasive Species Council of Metro Vancouver. She's conducted research on the effects of invasive plants on pollinators in Garry Oak ecosystems and contributed to restoration projects to conserve salmon populations. The Coastal Invasive Species Committee is a nonprofit, and I'm going to let Jessica talk about the committee that she works with. Jessica, are you ready?
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm very happy to be here this evening, and thank you for joining to chat about invasive species. So just a little overview of the presentation. I'll introduce you to some of the invasive species organizations serving Salt Spring Island, because you're very lucky you have several. And then we'll run through kind of the basics of invasive species. What are they? Why do we care? And then we'll go through, I'll lead you through some invasive species that are more commonly found and some to be on the watch for and to be actively preventing. As well as providing you with lots of great resources, and then we'll have a question period at the end. So invasive species organizations serving Salt Spring Island. There's our organization, of course, the Coastal Invasive Species Committee. So we are a nonprofit organization. We're one of many regional invasive species organizations functioning throughout BC, and that map there is outlining basically how the regions are divided. So we have Vancouver Island, the Sunshine Coast, and most of the Gulf Islands fall within our region. So quite wide and quite separated by water. It makes it a little bit challenging. But we do our best to serve everybody in that region. And our mission is to take a leadership role in collaboratively managing the negative impacts of new and existing invasive species through education, outreach, treatment, and prevention. So we have an education and outreach program, as well as a field operations program where we actively do treatments. There is also the Capital Regional District and the Capital Region Invasive Species Partnership, which Salt Spring Island would fall under. So this is another regional invasive species organization, kind of. It's run by the regional district. So it started in 2018 and has the goals of developing and delivering a coordinated approach to outreach, as well as encouraging collaboration and management within the Capital Regional District. As you can probably tell, collaboration is really important when managing invasive species, and especially cross-jurisdictional collaboration. Unfortunately, invasive species don't respect our imaginary boundaries that we've set up. And yeah, cross-governmental, borders. So the Capital Regional Invasive Species Partnership, also known as CRISP, is an intergovernmental working group, which is chaired by the Capital Regional District and has over 50 members, and they basically advise the regional district's invasive species program. So at the end of this presentation, I have my contact information, but I also have Jenny Eastman's contact information. She's the coordinator at CRISP, and she is also a great resource if you have questions or would like more resources than what's provided in this presentation. And then there's also the Invasive Species Council of BC. That's a provincial organization. And they have a similar kind of mandate. They're taking action to build healthy landscapes through education and responsible practices to prevent the spread of invasive species. And they have lots of wonderful resources available on their website, lots of online training courses, as well as printed material that you can either download in PDF form or order, guidebooks, things like that. And they also produce a lot of materials on these behavior change campaigns, which we'll get into a little bit later. All right, So what are invasive species? I understand that there's a varying level of experience and familiarity with invasive species in the audience. So we'll take it right back to basics to start. Invasive species are organisms existing outside their natural distribution or native range, and they have a negative impact on the environment, people, and or the economy. So there is a very important distinction to be made between exotic or non-native species and invasive species. For example, a lot of our agricultural crops are not necessarily native to where we're growing them, but they don't have that same kind of negative impact. So they're not considered invasive. And the same goes with a lot of horticultural plants, common garden plants. They're not necessarily native or naturally found here where we're growing them, but a lot of some become invasive, but a lot of them aren't invasive. They don't have that ability to cause negative impacts to the environment, people, or the economy. What characteristics make species invasive? Generally, they're highly competitive for resources like space, light, water, and nutrients. They reproduce quickly and or produce a very large number of offspring. So you'll see a lot of times when we're talking about invasive species, we'll be like, they produce 30,000 seeds per plant, which is a huge number of seeds. And yeah, that reproductive competitiveness and ability really contributes to invasiveness. They also generally have a lack of natural enemies and other population constraints. So in their natural range, they would perhaps have these reproductive abilities, but they maybe have predators, insects, or other diseases that keep them in check, or even other plants that are competing with them, or other organisms that are competing with them. And that's kind of the foundation of biocontrol. We won't get too much into that, but some of these plants, we do introduce things, often insects. We take them from the natural range, do a whole bunch of testing to make sure they're not going to become an issue, and then introduce them to act as a competitor and keep those numbers in check. One thing to keep an eye out for at the garden center, because a lot of when we do webinars like this, we often talk a lot about garden centers and what the average person can be doing to help reduce the introduction of invasive species and the spread. Unfortunately, a lot of invasives are still sold at garden centers. And there are a lot of invasives make their entry to this area via the horticulture route. So even something that we're not necessarily advertising as invasive right now, or have really determined is invasive right now, may be newer to the horticultural industry here and has potential to become invasive. So we always tell people, watch out for plants being advertised as fast growers, prolific spreaders, things to that effect in the garden center. If you see that on a tag, it's best to just take pause, perhaps pull up Google on your phone, do a little research, and make sure that that's not going to become an issue in your garden, but also potentially escaping outside your garden. Impacts of invasive species. So like I said, to be considered an invasive species, that organism needs to have some kind of negative environmental, economic, or kind of people-focused negative impact. So environmental impacts. Invasive species often outcompete native species for water, soil, and nutrients. So they're stealing resources from the plants that would naturally be growing there. They reduce biodiversity, degrade habitat, threaten species at risk, and cause erosion and water siltation. So the photo there we have, it's a little bit hard to make out, but those are actually, that's a bat, and it's been caught in burdock burrs. So burdock is an invasive species here, and it produces these kind of, they're usually about kind of that big, burrs, and it's actually the burrs, the person who invented Velcro got the idea, the concept of Velcro from these burrs. So they're so sticky, and they stick to your clothes if you're going hiking and brush up against them, but they'll also stick to bats, and they've been documented to cause death in bats because they stick to them and then they can't fly anymore. So that's an example of, yeah, a threat to other animals. And invasive species are considered to be the second greatest threat to biodiversity worldwide, only second to habitat loss. As I mentioned, invasive species also have negative impacts on people, potentially. They threaten human health and safety, reduce ecosystem services. So things like increasing water siltation decreases the ecosystem service of clean water, of nature providing us with clean water. And they also threaten culturally significant areas and first foods. So this photo here is of a recent newspaper article. It came out March 6th, so earlier this month. And it is a child hospitalized after ingesting poison hemlock. It says poisonous hemlock, but the plant is actually called poison hemlock, at Langford School. So this is a great example of probably not identification of invasive species, and the potential negative impacts to human health and safety that it can have. We'll talk a little bit about poison hemlock and how to ID that later on. But yeah, we have a multitude of invasive plants that do cause either skin irritation or serious rashes and burns, or are poisonous to either humans or livestock or animals. Economic impacts. So invasive species often threaten infrastructure. They can reduce crop yields, fisheries and forest production, and increase the risk of fire. I'm sure you're all aware of Scotch broom, a very popular invasive species on the island. And it is a highly flammable species, so it definitely, in areas where it's prominent, increases the fire risk. It contains an oily, flammable substance in its leaves. They're not like totally like leaves, but yeah. And this photo here is of a zebra and quagga mussels. So those are freshwater invasive mussels, and they're not like our normal saltwater mussels we kind of think of as being about this big. These ones are much smaller. And where they have been introduced in Eastern Canada and in the United States, they completely take over. So this is a propeller completely covered in zebra and quagga mussels. And this is one that we're actively trying to prevent in BC. There's quite a bit going on to prevent that. And our organization does monitoring for that too. So if there is a detection, there would be the ability to respond very rapidly and hopefully not have it spread to any other water bodies in BC. So far, it hasn't been detected in BC. And we've had at least one province or state buffer with no detections until actually this summer, where it was found in Idaho in the Snake River, which connects to the Columbia River. But that was dealt with, and to my knowledge, it's being actively monitored and taken care of. But it did definitely kind of raise more flags in BC that we need to be prepared if these are detected. Yeah, they can have really devastating effects on water treatment plants, recreation, basically anything to do with water. So how do these invasive species get here? There's two main pathways of introduction and spread, intentional and unintentional. Intentional introductions would include the horticultural industry, wildflower mixes and medicinal plants, the pet trade, and erosion control. For example, yellow flag iris at one point, which is quite an invasive aquatic species, was actually planted purposefully in restoration areas. at one point because it stabilized slopes or stabilized like interfaces between water and land in wetlands. Yeah, and established really nicely. But kind of little did people know that it would completely take over given time. And then there's unintentional introductions. For example, things like ballast water, movement of soil, hitchhikers on imported plants, firewood, agricultural products, and the like, as well as spread on contaminated hiking boots, boats, recreational equipment, and lots of gear that people like to use in the outdoors. Yeah, so this one's really important. Of course, we want to avoid intentionally introducing plants. We want to avoid buying plants from the garden center that we know are invasive and planting those in our yard. But we also want to be mindful when we're moving soil. Things like European fire ants are very easily moved in soil, as well as a lot of plants through seeds and plant fragments, as well as being mindful when we're playing in different areas, whether that be hiking, boating, that we're not carrying any invaders with us and moving them around. So what are the main things that you can do to prevent invasive species introductions and their spread? First of all, know your plants. This should be all species, but plants kind of are the prominent one. And they're a lot, yeah, you want to know your plants. And you want to minimize soil disturbance and revegetate disturbed sites. So I have two little photos there. One is a weed ID book and one is a iNaturalist app symbol. There's also other really, really fantastic plant ID apps out there, like Picture This I personally use, where you can just have it on your phone. There's a free version and you can take a photo out in wherever you are, and it will give you a suggestion of what that plant is. It's usually fairly good, at least good enough to kind of narrow it down to a few options, and then with a little extra research, you can usually figure out what things are. Yeah, really important. Know what you're growing in your area and what you're planting. And invasive species love disturbed soil, disturbed sites in general. So trying not to leave any disturbed bare soil, revegetating whenever possible, or mulching, or doing something where soil isn't left bare. Planting native or non-invasive species whenever possible. We always love to encourage people to plant native species whenever possible. They're going to be more adapted to your area, which means they're going to require less water. They're going to be more drought tolerant. They're also going to be what our pollinators are used to, what our native animal species are used to. So they're just all around a fantastic option. But if you have your heart set on certain species, just making sure that they're not invasive before you plant them. And as I mentioned before, cleaning gear when moving between sites or areas, whether that be brushing off your hiking boots after going for a hike, or cleaning and draining and drying your boat before moving water bodies. So I have here a few of our behavior change campaigns. These are really promoted by the Invasive Species Council of BC, as well as all the other regional invasive species organizations. And the main ones are Play, Clean, Go, Clean, Drain, Dry, Plant Wise, Buy Local, Burn Local, Don't Let It Loose. So Play, Clean, Go is really targeted for recreational users. Like I said, when you're hiking, when you're out and about, make sure you don't have any seeds on your clothes or plant material. You haven't picked up anything in your boots, soil that might have seeds in it or anything like that. A lot of times things get spread that way. Clean, Drain, Dry is targeted at aquatics, largely boating, but it also applies to Things like if you're wading through a creek, crossing a creek in your rubber boots, or if you are a fisherman, if you fish and you fish in waders. So cleaning, not so much draining, but cleaning and drying those pieces of equipment before moving water bodies is really crucial to preventing things like invasive mussels. The larvae for invasive mussels are very small and they can survive a long time outside of water, as well as aquatic invasive plants. Plant-wise is targeted at gardeners and those who love horticultural plants. Again, knowing your plants, knowing what you're planting, and knowing whether they have invasive qualities. Buy local, burn local is targeted at firewood. Firewood's actually a common culprit of moving invasive species, especially insects. They like to hide in the wood. So whenever you're entering, if you're going camping, try not to stock your, fill your truck up with wood and then drive it halfway across BC. Try to buy wood where you're planning on burning it. And don't let it loose. Please, please, please don't let your pets loose in the wild. It's not fair to them, but also it is a common way that invasive animals get introduced. For example, red ear slider, common pet turtle you can buy. People got a little tired of their turtles and let them loose in a lake. And now a lot of our lakes have and wetland areas have red-eared sliders, and they compete with our native Western painted turtle. Yeah, so what you can do, those were all kind of targeted at prevention. Preventing invasive species is the most effective way of dealing with invasive species. It's the most cost effective. It's the easiest. It's also the hardest way to see results. So you can be very, very diligent and have nothing introduced. And it's hard to see that payoff. But that diligence is really important. So what we have here is an invasion curve. I'm not sure how well you can make that out, but the orange is prevention, the green is eradication, the red is containment, and the kind of yellow green pea color is asset-based protection. So this is, and the bottom axis is time. So we work really hard to prevent invasive species from being introduced. But when an invasive species is introduced, there's a small period of time in a given area where you have the potential of eradicating it. So some of the species, we'll go through species a little bit later. The ones towards the end, their prevention, and I think there's a few species in there that you don't have in very big numbers on Salt Spring Island. And Salt Spring it's nice because it is an island, it is a little bit contained. You do have surrounded by water, so you have kind of these borders created for you, which is handy when managing invasive species. So eradication in BC especially, we have early detection rapid response species, and these species are still up for eradication. They're not in the province or in a certain area in very large numbers, and we really, really want to get those dealt with while we still have the possibility of eradicating them. After that, you move on to containment. So you're just trying to, you have it in a certain area and you're trying not to let it spread to other areas. And after that, for something, say like Himalayan blackberry on Vancouver Island or Scotch broom, it's there in such abundant numbers that you're likely never going to be able to get rid of it. So you move to kind of asset-based protection. So basically, if you have a sensitive habitat or an area where you know there's species at risk or potentially a culturally sensitive area, you would put your efforts in management into those areas to protect certain assets on the land. And there's a few different ways of controlling invasive species, or a few categories of ways of controlling invasive species. There's cultural ways, so things like Shading out species. So Scotch broom, if you have tried to plant species and create a canopy cover, you will help reduce the ability for Scotch broom to thrive. There's manual and mechanical control. A lot of things that people probably you're already doing to control weeds in your garden or invasive species, digging, cutting, pulling, mowing. Those are all options, as well as when you get into kind of larger scale infestations, things like tilling can be effective for certain invasive species. Biological control, I already mentioned. Some species in BC have certain predators, or they're generally insects or nematodes that are introduced, sometimes bacteria that are introduced. Those are highly regulated in terms of determining what biological control agents can be released in BC, because they're also generally not, or they're also not native to this area. So there's rigorous testing that, and it's usually a multi-year process to determine what we can release here, because we really don't want a situation where we've just created an additional invasive species. And then chemical treatment. Using herbicides, generally when we're talking about plants, is an option. Our organization tries to take an integrated pest management approach when we do determinations of how we are going to treat certain species. So wherever possible, you want to be minimizing the use of chemicals. But certain species like knotweed species, it can be the only option for certain species. And then always try to follow best management practices. There's lots of fantastic resources out there. I have a resource slide at the end, and I think these slides may be distributed after this. So there's lots of links I've included in there to some really, really good resources and really thorough best management practices if you do find yourself having any of the species we're going to talk about, or battling invasive species. Try to find yourself a good best management practices document. All right, disposal. Always a hot topic when talking about invasive species. So you've tackled some ivy in your backyard. What are you going to do with it? So what we do want to encourage you to do is take it to a landfill or transfer station. So Blackburn Transfer Station on Salt Spring Island, I've been told, takes invasive species, as well as the Heartland landfill in Saanich. When you're taking invasive species to a landfill, it's always good practice to bag and tag them, put them in a garbage bag, or like ideally a clear garbage bag, so the staff there can actually see what you have in there, and tag them, like tie some tape on them or write invasive plant and what it is. And when you go to the landfill, inform the staff what you have and also that it's invasive. If you have a large amount, if you've been really keen on your invasive plant removal and have like a truckload of something, it's always good practice to call ahead. Every facility seems to have a different protocol for handling invasive species, just depending on how they're set up. And sometimes if you're bringing a high volume in, they'll make special arrangements or kind of run their operations that day accordingly to make sure that it's dealt with properly. There are some species that have a little bit of flexibility in terms of just leaving them on site to decompose. Those are often found in best management practices, but yeah, you won't go around taking them to the landfill. And what not to do, don't compost them. If you are going to leave them on site to decompose, you always want to leave them on an area that's already infested and that you're monitoring. You never want to put them in your compost bin, either at your house or is there compost collection on Salt Spring? No. Okay. Yeah, so you never want to put them in your compost bin because there is potential to have seeds or plant fragments not compost properly. And then when you go to spread that compost, you're just making your life harder. Reporting. So for species that you find out and about, especially high priority species like knotweeds, giant hogweeds, some of the species that you might be looking to prevent on Salt Spring Island, it's really helpful to report invasive species. There's a couple of different ways to do it. You can report through your regional invasive species organization. So by sending us an email or calling us. We prefer email. And if you can have a picture and GPS coordinates or a very detailed description, we really appreciate that. Or you can report it to the CRD. They have an online form and the link is there. They also have a phone number and you can call it in. But again, they probably prefer it going through the online form as well. There, you can also report to the province. So they have a Report Invasive Species mobile app for Android and for Apple, and they also have an online form. There used to be, there's been a little bit of staff turnover lately, and there used to be more communication between the province and the regional committees in terms of reports. So I do suggest for now reporting to your either to both or to your regional invasive species organization, either myself or the Capital Regional District. Yeah, but reporting to both is always fantastic. All right, so I have a few several species to run through. I have a few species to run through. We'll start with the common culprits. These ones are more abundant on Salt Spring Island and ones that you may have on your property. Yeah. Okay, so the first one is yellow flag iris. I already mentioned this as one that was at one point used as a restoration plant. So yellow flag iris, it is probably emerging right about now, and you can ID it because it has, it sometimes looks like cattail at this time of year. They start to emerge around the same time. Cattail will end up growing taller, but cattail has a a round stem, and yellow flag iris will have a flattened stem. There is a photo of it there, but it's kind of hard to tell. Yeah, but basically, if you see a iris with a yellow flower, it is likely yellow flag iris. We don't have many yellow irises in BC. It alters habitat, including the width of watercourses by trapping sediment and increasing elevation. It's difficult to remove once established and has rhizomes that form thick interwoven mats. It also produces seed pods that are buoyant and can remain afloat for up to a year and spread long distances down watercourses. It also can cause skin irritation in humans and is poisonous to livestock if ingested. It can be dealt with manually. You can dig up the rhizomes if you're careful. It's not fun to manually remove. There are also benthic barriers you can install. Catherine Tarasoff, based in Kamloops, has done a lot of trial work with this, and it's becoming a good, a more widespread way of managing invasive yellow flag iris. So basically, you cut the plant down and install what she recommends. It's basically like what covers gymnast mats. And then you install that for about a year or so, and it basically cuts off the oxygen transfer between the plant or the air. It cuts off the air that the plant needs to be taking in, and essentially the plant drowns. Yeah, it's quite effective and is a little bit less labor intensive, although it takes a long time. And then, yeah, if you are unable to do either of those, at least making sure that the seed pods aren't, that it's not going to seed. So sometimes in areas where it can't be dealt with manually or with benthic barrier, people are just continually snipping the seed pods every year. Daphne laurel, it's also known as spurge laurel. A lot of these invasive plants have multiple common names. This one has toxic sap that can cause skin rashes, nausea, swelling of the tongue, and if enough is ingested, coma. It produces blackberries and spreads through seeds or vegetative shoots. And it's tolerant of both sun and shade and forms dense thickets. It can be fairly easily removed just by cutting below. Well, if you have plants small enough to pull them out, you can pull them out. For larger plants, you can cut just below the root collar. That's kind of trying to go down just a little. The root collar is kind of where the root becomes the stem. So cutting just below that can be a fairly effective way of managing it as well. Anytime you're managing invasive species, you do want to be monitoring, going back and having a look at that site in the coming years to make sure that there aren't seeds coming up and that there's not new vegetative growth maybe coming up from plant fragments that were missed or roots that were missed. Some plants have a much greater ability to grow from plant material that was missed, like roots, and some, like this, won't have that ability as much. Yeah, Daphne laurel, you do want to be cautious when you are removing it. Any of the ones that mention that they're toxic, you want to be taking proper precautions. And this is, again, when finding a good best management practices document comes in really handy, because they often outline all the proper precautions to be taking. The Invasive Species Council of Metro Vancouver has some really, really fantastic, very thorough best management practices documents, and I have links to those in our resource pages. They have one for Daphne laurel, and it outlines all the precautions as well as exactly how to take care of it. English holly is another common one. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with this. People love it because it reminds them of Christmas, but it is, yeah, an invasive species and one that can spread quite far distances because the birds eat the seeds and drop them in different places. So sometimes they'll be out in the forest and you'll find just one holly plant kind of in the woods and wonder, how did that get here? It's commonly used as an ornamental, as I mentioned, for holiday decorations and for floral arrangements. It grows in sun or shade, and it crowds out native species and monopolizes groundwater. The berries are also toxic to humans and pets, but as I said, they're spread by birds. This is one that if it's small, you can pull it out or dig it out. When it starts to get larger, like a tree, there are other options such as girdling. But if it gets to be a large tree, anytime something's getting to be a large tree, you do have to have considerations of, okay, if I do kill this plant, how is that going to become a danger tree later on? I'm also not sure about the local bylaws on Salt Spring, but I have chatted with people in Metro Vancouver that actually had holly trees that were tree-sized that they wanted to remove because they were invasive, but they couldn't because of their bylaws regulating what trees you couldn't cut down. So if the trunk was thick enough, you couldn't legally cut that tree down. So you do want to be careful of things like that. I'm sure if you went and applied for a special permit and argued your case, you would be able to, but yeah, there are sometimes funny legislation, things like that. English ivy is another really common one. It forms dense mats and suppresses native plants and climbs trees, reducing their lifespan and leaving them more susceptible to wind damage. It grows rapidly and needs very little light or water once established, and reproduces through seeds as well as vegetatively. This one can be pulled. You do want to be careful that you're not leaving root fragments behind. It's often hard, and generally the best way to do it is to do one pass if you have a thick mat, and then go back and get any regrowth periodically. It also is known for climbing trees and strangling them. So a lot of times we'll kind of advise people to, as a priority, protect the trees. So you can, people call it the ring of life or the circle of life. Ring of life, I think. Circle of life is something different. But yeah, if you come in and you cut it at chest height and basically strip all the ivy off down the trunk from chest height down, and clear an area around there, it will at least save the tree. But you do have to be diligent about keeping that up. Birch turtle is found in most growing conditions. It likes moist and disturbed areas such as roadside meadows and riparian areas. It has little white flowers that produce burr-like seeds and has a pronounced peak covered in bristles that are easily stuck to humans and animals. It outcompetes native vegetation, forming monocultures and reducing natural biodiversity. Another one that can be pulled or dug. A lot of the chervil, poison hemlock, giant hogweed, they're all in the carrot family. So they all have tap roots and they're relatively easy to remove, but they are prolific spreaders if you allow them to go to seed. Yeah, so you definitely want to be dealing with them early when they're not widespread. Yellow archangel is another one. Some people call it lamium as well. Lamium is a common name that refers to a variety of species, but I hear it often referred to as that. This is a very common garden escapee. You'll find it often in hanging baskets, still commonly sold today, unfortunately. It's perennial plant. It prefers shady sites and will often grow in forest understories, in dense mats, and it smothers native vegetation. It spreads by seeds and also by plant fragments. It can be managed similarly to ivy. It doesn't have the same tendency to climb trees, but yeah, it can be pulled or very, very carefully dug. It's a really hard one to deal with because it fragments really easily. So you have to be very careful and expect to have to make multiple passes. It can also be dealt with by smothering or mulching. So often some kind of combination where you do like a first pass of pulling, try to remove as much as you can, and then either laying cardboard or some other kind of mulch down to try to suppress regrowth. Wendy, can you hear the puppy in the background? A little bit? Okay. Let me know if
yeah, it's no, just a little bit, but I think it's okay.
perfect. Okay. Awesome. Burdock is one that I mentioned before. It has got some media attention for its ability to its negative impacts on bats. It grows in farmlands, pasture roadsides, and stream banks, and is a prolific spreader. An individual plant can produce up to 16,000 seeds, which is a lot. It has burrs that cling to clothes, and it spreads that way. It can spread long distances that way on people or on animals. It has large leaves and reduces light for other herbaceous plants. There's 3 species present in BC: common burdock, greater burdock, and woolly burdock. But they all have these kind of largish leaves. It's always really hard to describe what a plant looks like, and even from photos. So again, I really recommend getting the plant ID app and just having curiosity when you're out and about hiking in your yard, getting to know all your plants. And it has these kind of purplish flowers that then kind of harden and become the burrs. Tansy ragwort, there's two tansies that we have in BC. We have common tansy and tansy ragwort. They look fairly similar in their leaves to the untrained eye. Tansy ragwort has yellow flowers that have petals, where common tansy just has little buttons. But if you see these, they have very unique leaves. They're biennial, short-lived plants, sometimes perennial. They grow in pasture lands and disturbed areas, and a single plant can produce up to 150,000 seeds, which is astronomical. And those seeds can survive in the soil for up to 15 years, which is a very long time as well. They're easily transported by wind, soil, human activities, livestock. If ingested, tansy ragwort can cause liver damage in livestock. This one can be dug out quite successfully. It's digging and those kind of manual removals always gets challenging when it's a large infestation. But if you encounter a small amount of this on your property, yeah, it can be dug out. Okay, I'm going to speed up a little bit because we do have a number of species here and still left to go. And I just want to leave enough time for questions. So Scotch broom and gorse, I'm sure everybody is familiar with Scotch broom. Gorse is looks similar to Scotch broom except with prickles, quite aggressive looking spines. And Scotch broom, yeah, can be dealt with by pulling or digging. If you cut the younger plants, they will often resprout. But if you start to cut the stems when they're about that thick or thicker, that often just deals with it. And if you can cut it right after it's flowered, before it's gone to seed, that is great because it's when the plant has the least amount of reserves in the root to resprout. Butterfly bush is a really commonly still sold in garden centers. It looks a little bit like a lilac tree, lilac bush. The flowers has these purple kind of cone-shaped flowers and can grow quite large, like a large shrub, small tree sized. Plants that pollinators really are attracted to, people always get a little bit defensive of. But the fact is that if you replace that with a native species, it's going to be so much better for our pollinators. Periwinkle, another common one sold in garden centers, unfortunately. This is a low-lying ground cover. It has quite a waxy leaf and purple flowers. There's two kinds of periwinkle. One has a smaller leaf and one has a larger leaf, but they're both invasive and have similar effects. Yeah, they spread rapidly through the forest understory, preferring shady conditions and moist conditions, and they reproduce through seed and vegetatively. Bull thistle and Canada thistle both have purple flowers. Bull thistle is quite aggressive looking and quite spiny. Canada thistle is slightly less aggressive looking. All thistles are a little bit aggressive looking. Canada thistle mostly spreads through lateral roots, and bull thistle reproduces through seeds primarily. So bull thistle can be dug out. Canada thistle, your best bet is to mow it continuously and really prevent it from going to seed. You can also dig it out, but you do need to be careful about the lateral roots, and sometimes that can trigger it to be more aggressive, come back more aggressively. Oxeye daisy is another common one found in pastures, grasslands, and along roadsides. It's a prolific reproducer and outcompetes native plants. It looks a little bit like a daisy. It doesn't grow quite as large as like things like a Shasta daisy would, which is not invasive. Cutleaf and Himalayan blackberries. We have 3 main kinds of blackberries in BC. Cutleaf blackberry has very serrated leaves, kind of looks like somebody cut them out with scissors. Himalayan blackberry is probably what you commonly think of when someone says blackberry. But we also have a native species trailing blackberry. The trailing blackberry is much less aggressive, and it is a ground cover, an understory ground cover, whereas Himalayan blackberry and cutleaf blackberry kind of more form these like bramble bushes. Yeah, very aggressive. I'm sure everyone is familiar with at least Himalayan blackberry. And yeah, it can be dug out successfully if you can brave the thorns, and it can be quite a bit of work. Reed canary grass is another one. This photo is not great. It's always hard to take good photos of plants when everything else in the photo is a plant, but it's kind of that clump of grass in the forefront. It forms thick mats along ditches, wetlands, and streams, and yeah, very good at forming a monoculture, especially in wetland areas where it can alter stream flow, increase bank sediment, and obstruct salmon migration routes. It can be controlled by digging out. It's quite a lot of work. There is also Catherine Tarasoff, who's done the work with benthic barriers on yellow flag iris, is also trialing benthic barriers on reed canary grass as a potential control for the future. Yeah, so those are common ones that you may see out and about on your property. We also have a few less common ones that I will run through quickly. I won't go over best management practices for them, just kind of, I want to make you aware of them so you can keep an eye out. And if you do come across them, feel free to reach out to myself or Jenny Eastman for more information. So giant hogweed, this is a very large plant. You can see that person there. The plant is probably 3 or 4 feet taller than them when it's in flower. This one is very toxic. It has, you don't want to touch this plant. It has sap that is reacts with sunlight to cause reoccurring burns, and the burns can reoccur for 5-10 years. It's quite a nasty one, but has very large leaves, and I always like to say it looks angry. Poison hemlock is another one. It's in the carrot family. It grows about 5 or 6 feet tall, about like the size of a person when it's flowering. And has a white flower head and very carrot-looking leaves. It's high priority to manage in publicly accessed locations due to the health risks of it. And it is found. I believe you have 1 or 2 sites on Salt Spring Island, but yeah, on Vancouver Island becoming more established. Yeah. Okay. Do we want to do a few questions? Oh, I think you're muted.
Yes, I am. Thank you. Yeah, there was a question from 2 participants, Adria, and also, all I have is a last name, Nesbitt, asking about holly. So they have a holly bush and the shoots, they've cut it down. Shoots keep coming back from the stump. It's about 3 to 4 inches in diameter. Considering to cut it back lower, but it's going to be tricky to take down to the root collar. Any other ideas?
The Invasive Species Council of Metro Vancouver has a really good best management practices document on holly. So I would potentially give that a read. But just off the top of my head from my experience dealing with holly, if you're patient, you could continually cut the regrowth. At some point, you will hopefully exhaust the root system. It'll keep using what reserves it has in the root system to send up shoots. But if you can keep trimming those and not let the plant photosynthesize, that will generally eventually result in it dying. That can be how long that will take. I'm not sure. It can be a long game. But if it's in your yard and you're able to do that with relative ease, that's an option. For the larger plants like that, if it's already cut, there is potentially herbicide is an option. Again, if you can manage it without herbicide, that's always the preference. But for plants like that, cutting and just painting a little bit of herbicide on the stem is often effective. And that just gets absorbed down into the roots and will kill what is remaining of the plant there. Yeah, you could also potentially talk to an arborist. I'm not sure. I know sometimes people grind stumps. So potentially getting an arborist on board to do something like that, or they may not even need to be like somebody that is a tree service. Yeah, sometimes the trees are challenging. Yes, Wendy.
Jessica, one method that I've used in the past that works pretty well is called frilling. And you basically frill, you take your axe or a tool that works like an axe mallet, mattock, and you cut pieces like ribbons, and you cut the outer trunk of the holly. And this works for other species as well, like the common black hawthorn, not black hawthorn, but common hawthorn. And you frill it with your saw, shaving back and kind of cutting into the top of the stump. And it works really well, along with snipping those little leaders that come out. That should do the trick.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yeah. Another comment or question was, is it safe to burn invasive plants as a mean of disposal?
It depends. It depends on the plant. Certain plants like Daphne laurel or spurge laurel, it's not recommended. It has basically any plant that's toxic, I would not burn. Yeah, Daphne laurel, you can potentially release those toxins into the air when you're burning them, which is a health hazard for you being there tending your fire. Other species, it would be fine, like Scotch broom, if you can do that in a really controlled environment, and you're not worried about it being like it is highly flammable, so you do have to be a little bit careful. But something like that would be fine to burn. So that's kind of, again, where I would go back and refer to the best management practices. Yeah, it's going to be species specific.
Okay, and we have one hand up. I don't have a name. Annam. Ann. Hi, Ann.
Hi, Ann. Yeah, I'm Ann. I've recently moved to Salt Spring. I've taken out, I don't know, about 10 truckloads of ivy from my very small lot. I think I've been lucky because I advertised on the exchange, and I'm now feeding about, I'm up to 5 herds of goats. And apparently they like the ivy. So after I spent $140 taking 2 loads to Blackburn, I found another way. But I'm really concerned about all the ivy I see in our local Mowat Park. There's a tree absolutely covered, like a beautiful, I think it might even be an oak, but I can't tell because it's so totally covered by ivy. You know, I'm kind of appalled that we just sort of walk by it all the time. And you know, again, for holly, like now I see little tiny holly trees by the path. And then I'll just look around and I'll look 20 feet away and there will be a huge mother of a holly plant. And it's so embedded and we don't seem to be doing anything about it. And I recognize why, because what are we going to do with it if, you know, I wouldn't mind organizing a workforce, but really, what are we going to do with it?
Like what are you going to do with the material?
Yeah, what are we going to do with the material?
Yeah, do you, who would be managing that park?
Moet Park, I don't know.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not, our region is so large, I'm not familiar with,
Yeah.
with all of the, areas.
Well,
based on all
it's,
of
you know,
the-
it is a major park right in the midst of Ganges, like everyone walks through it, like, you know, it would be almost a showpiece for taking
Yeah.
back the land, but
We have,
unless we,
oh, I'm sorry, yeah. We
yeah,
have
unless we can really
Jane,
get rid of it.
there is Jane. Do you want to speak about the invasive species group going into Moats?
Yeah, it was there is an invasive species group through Transition Salt Spring, and they do go in once, sometimes twice a year, and they do coordinate with CRD, and CRD do actually take that ivy away for us. So you'll get kind of 20 people going in with bags and gloves and clearing it, and CRD take it. The priority is because it's so bad. We're managing fire risk when we do it, and we're just protecting, you know, the most vulnerable trees. We're never going to get it out of Moats because there's so much, but it is that case of just trying to protect the vulnerable trees and manage the fire risk. That's kind of the priority that's taken with it, but it grows so quickly.
Yeah, it's definitely challenging, and that kind of goes into that, if we go back to that invasion curve, right? Asset based management. So managing for fire risk would be a case of that. Yeah, it's that maybe would be more one to reach out to Jenny Eastman about too, if you had a specific kind of, you know, it sounds like there already are an organization managing invasives in that park, but sometimes if you have a certain interest, the regional district or whatnot will work with you to try to use that volunteer time. Yeah. So I would maybe, if you have a specific interest in that specific area, to reach out to Jenny Eastman.
Okay. I think that sums up our questions right now.
I think
And
there's one more hand that just went up.
oh, sorry. Yes, Bernadette.
Yes, hello. Thank you for listening to me. I came a little bit late, sorry, but about the hawthorn, the English hawthorn, we have quite a bit of hawthorn on Bourgogne Bay, and since it's invasive, they decided to cut it down. But we have a large group of birders on the island, and we're very horrified because having hedges for the birds is very, very important, and cutting them down now in late March, it's also pretty bad because the birds are just coming back to their nesting grounds. And I was just wondering what is more important for you. Is it removing the invasive plant, which doesn't really invade that much, and leave it for the birds, or should we continue take it down? Because I think they have a plan to take it down.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it is something that that does come up around various species like Himalayan blackberry as well. There's sometimes that kind of pros and cons you're weighing. Ideally, what you would want to do is, if you're removing invasive species, trying to replant that area, kind of like going back to not leaving bare soil, not leaving bare areas. If you can replant that with a native plant that is going to offer that same kind of habitat value, that would be the best case scenario. It's a tricky one, and it does sometimes depend. Generally, unless it's a very barren landscape, they will find somewhere else to go. But if you can try to put back that that kind of habitat value through native plants, that's the
Yeah,
best to do.
I think they can use the black hawthorn, which is native, and it might take a while. So maybe they should do it very gently, you know, over maybe 10 years or something. So there's always something there as a hedge.
Yeah, and it is a balance too, right? Even species that aren't as necessarily aggressive, if they are invasive or known to be invasive in the area, it is better to get them when they're not, when they are in smaller numbers. So it may kind of seem like sometimes they're being taken care of before it's a big issue, but that's the best time to be dealing with the invasive species as well. Yeah,
Okay.
it's a tricky kind of situation, but yeah, basically, if you can be removing the invasive species, you do want to be, and then trying to put in something native that will offer similar kind of.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Great questions. Thanks, everybody. All right. Well, I think let's carry on.
Okay,
And I'm
perfect.
sure more questions will be coming in.
Sounds good. We don't have too many more. So yeah, shiny geranium has been found on Salt Spring Island. It is sometimes confused with Dubsfoot or Herb Robert or Cranesbill. They all look kind of similar. They all are geraniums and have those pink flowers. But shiny geranium has a kidney-shaped outline and is fairly glossy. Honestly, Wendy is better at IDing it than I am. We don't have it in a lot of the areas that I'm doing my work in. Also, Jenny Eastman from the CRD would be a good resource for IDing it as well. But this little ID summary is also really good. This is from the province and kind of outlines the difference between the different species. Himalayan balsam, or also known as policeman's helmet. This really loves moist areas. It often grows along streams. It's one of my personal favorite invasives. It smells amazing, and it's one of the funnest plants to pull. It pops out of the ground really easily and can be fairly effectively managed by pulling. You just want to make sure you're not disturbing it when it's in seeds, because its seeds are distributed via explosion. So the seeds actually pop and kind of fling out when they're ripe. Maltese star thistle. This prefers open, sunny, disturbed areas such as roadsides, rangeline pastures, and cultivated fields. It displaces native vegetation, reduces forage, and can cause injury to livestock because of its spines. And again, a thistle, it has a yellow flower and kind of the spines around the flower. Orange hawkweed is another, I guess you don't have it too much on Salt Spring Island, but it is found relatively commonly in our region. It forms dense mats and outcompetes native species. It spreads through horizontal runners as well as seeds. And hawkweeds I usually look for hairy leaves. If the leaves are very hairy, there's a chance that it may be a hawkweed. And orange hawkweed is the only species that is orange in BC. We have yellow hawkweeds as well. Some of those species are native and some of them are not, but if it's orange, it's definitely orange hawkweed and it's invasive. And it sends up these stems with these little flower kind of clusters on the end of it. Species to prevent. So these are species that are not currently found on Salt Spring Island, but are likely to arrive at some time in the near future. So these are ones to keep an eye out for. Knotweed species. Sorry, do you have any knotweed on Salt Spring Island, Wendy, that you know about?
I'm just gonna check my list if we have any that has been spotted on iNaturalist, and I don't see. But if there's anyone here in our chat, in our talk that has seen knotweed, I haven't heard about it on the island.
That's
Let's see
very
it.
fortunate. It's not one that you want. Knotweed is one of the plants that we deal with the most. It's quite a nasty invasive. It's very invasive and it likes to take over riparian areas and has negative impacts on our salmon. It also, the root systems are damaging for infrastructure. So yeah, one to report. This one would be a key one to report if you did find it, and to also treat. There's several species, or 4 species in BC. The more common ones, Himalayan knotweed is not commonly found and looks a little bit different, but Japanese, giant, and Bohemian look fairly similar. Giant is just a lot larger, and Bohemian is a hybrid between Japanese and giant. They have like very simple looking leaves and canes that look a little bit similar to bamboo, but they don't have the same kind of leaf as bamboo. They have like a very, I always say, if you were to just draw me a very, very simple leaf, that's kind of what a Japanese knotweed leaf or a knotweed leaf looks like. Tree of Heaven is another one to be on the lookout for. There are reports of it on Vancouver Island. The species again has root systems that are damaging to infrastructure. It's a deciduous tree and grows in a whole range of environments. You can see here, the one in the picture is basically growing out of the sidewalk. Aside from it being an invasive tree, another reason we're concerned about this species is it's a preferred host for spotted lanternfly, which is an invasive species insect that we don't currently have here, but should it also make its way here, if we have established Tree of Heaven, it's going to make the problem much, much worse. And spotted lanternfly is a pest for a lot of our fruit and berry crops. So a threat to agriculture. Garlic mustard, another one we want to be on the lookout for. This is a herbaceous plant. You should never touch a plant that you don't know what it is, because some plants are toxic and have skin irritating properties. But this plant, one way to help tell what it is or confirm what it is if you crumple a leaf, it smells very strongly of garlic. It has little white flowers and kind of kidney-shaped leaves. And there are confirmed sightings on the island, but yeah, has not been found on Salt Spring Island yet. Lesser celandine, similar, it's a ground cover, reproduces by seed and vegetatively. It has these bright yellow flowers, and it is toxic to most mammals, causing sickness in livestock and occasionally death. That is the end of my species. This is very small font, but this I believe will be distributed. These are some really fantastic links, or at least Wendy, if the PowerPoint is going to be distributed, maybe just this list of resources can be. It's a really good list of resources, best management practices, some more information on disposal, as well as a few different priority species lists. And some restoration and grow me instead guides for planting native species instead of native or non-invasive species instead of invasive species. And this is my contact information and Jenny Eastman contact information. As I mentioned, she's the coordinator with the with Chris, with the regional district. And she's going to be a great resource. She's a little bit more local for you guys. And yeah, is a great point of contact as well. Thank you so much for attending tonight. I hope that was helpful for you. It is always a lot to try to cover invasive species and all of the individual species. If you have any more questions, I kind of just skim the surface on a lot of the species. If you have any more questions, feel free to reach out to me. Yeah, happy to answer kind of more questions in depth. Or work with you to help eradicate species if you want some advice on best management practices. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you so much. Yay. We've got a few minutes, so I just want to address a couple more comments. Great
Sure.
comments that I think is of interest. Ron had a tip for removing Daphne and some of the other species as well, is to pull it now during this time of the year. It is in flower, but if you can get it before it goes to seed, the ground, when it's still wet, it's so much easier to pull out. And with that moist soil, you can even get some of the larger stems up by gently pulling. And it's always good to kind of, with gloves on, of course, put the stem between your fingers or your feet, and that way you can keep the soil down as you pull it up. So that's a good tip from Ron, thanks. And then
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. And anytime you are doing these manual removals, if you're digging or pulling, you do want to take a little bit of effort to disturb the soil as little as you can, especially with plants that are reproducing by seeds, because there may be a seed bank there. And if you're kind of disturbing and turning up the soil, you're potentially kind of encouraging those seeds that are in the seed bank to germinate. Yeah, but definitely easier to pull in moist soil.
And unfortunately, Japanese knotweed is at the community gardens near the pool. So we do have an observation of Japanese knotweed, which might take some further sleuthing to see if it's anywhere else.
Yeah, that would be really good to look into. And it would also be good to look into whether that's being managed or not. Because if it's just one site on Salt Spring, that would be
High
priority to manage.
Yep. Okay. Well, lots of thank yous. And here the CRD has been managing it. So
Perfect.
it is known and it's being managed, which is great.
Yeah.
Okay, we have maybe one or two more questions. If there are any others, feel free to raise your hand. And if there are no questions, I think we will say good night.
Awesome.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Jessica, for this great presentation. And we will see everybody soon.
Thank you so much. Have a great night.
Good night.